Okay, let's unpack this. We've got this collection of sources you've shared, mostly centered around a transcript from the 24 YouTube channel. Gives us a kind of snapshot of recent events around the Ukraine conflict. So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to go through all this material, pull out the important bits, the key knowledge, the insights, and help you cut through some of the noise.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll be looking at quite a range based on these sources, stuff happening within the U.S. government. What Russia's apparently saying its goals are alleged info ops, international reactions to get ready for, well, some maybe surprising facts and viewpoints reported straight from this material you sent over.
And what's really fascinating, I think, about these particular sources is the kind of the mosaic they create. You get different angles, often conflicting stories.
Definitely.
We're going to stick really closely just to what the material says these people, these groups are reportedly saying and doing. We'll, synthesize it, guide you through the reported dynamics, no outside info added, just helping you see the key points and connections as they appear in this specific set of documents.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut, your way to understand what these specific sources are highlighting about these, well, very complex and fast-moving events. So let's just jump right in. Let's get to the core of it. The sources spend a fair bit of time on the scrutiny of U.S. policy, some really direct questioning in the Senate, apparently. What did the sources show there?
Well, yeah, one really striking moment the transcript seems to capture involves U.S. Senator Marco Rubio.
Okay.
The sources describe him being asked, pretty directly, whether Vladimir Putin should be called a war criminal.
Right.
And what stands out is how the material reports his answer. He apparently acknowledged that military crimes were committed without doubt, but he reportedly stopped short of calling Putin a war criminal himself.
Oh, interesting.
Said he would not use that term when pushed, apparently, focusing instead on, ending the war as the main goal.
Wow, okay, that's very specific phrasing reported there. And the sources, didn't they highlight something about that stance, like comparing it to something he'd said before?
Exactly, yeah. The sources make a point of reminding us that back in, I think it was 2017, in a similar situation, the reporting indicated Senator Rubio did actually call Putin a war criminal. Mentioned things like targeting civilian infrastructure in Aleppo and Chechnya. So, yeah, this material definitely points to a reported shift in his language over time.
And that reported shift, it sounds like it's just one thread in a bigger, more complicated picture inside the U.S. government, at least as these sources present it. You also see reporting on a push for, more pressure.
Yes, absolutely. The material goes into detail about a reported bipartisan Senate bill. Senators Graham and Blumenthal kicked it off. Apparently got over 80 sponsors.
80, wow.
Yeah. And this bill, as the sources describe it, is aimed at hitting countries supporting Russia with some pretty severe tariffs. They specifically mention China buying cheap Russian oil.
Right.
The goal being, to isolate Russia economically. The sources quote them saying something like, if Russia doesn't show real steps toward ending the war, they can expect decisive actions from the U.S. Senate.
Okay, so you've got that strong bipartisan push for economic pressure reported. But then the sources bring in a reported stance from former President Trump that seems to be almost the opposite of that.
It does, yeah. The sources cite the Wall Street Journal reporting that Trump apparently believes Russia is actually winning the war. And because of that, doesn't really intend to end it, which reportedly contrasts with his public statement saying Putin genuinely wants peace.
Right, that seems contradictory based on the reporting. And didn't the sources also say Trump reportedly refused to ramp up sanctions, even though he had apparently suggested he might if Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire?
That's what the reporting indicates, yes. Instead of more sanctions, the sources say Trump urged Russia-Ukraine negotiation.
Okay.
And this reported approach, well, it seems to have caused some friction internally, according to these sources.
Like what?
Well, one specific thing the material mentions is the reported reason for the resignation of the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink.
Ah, yes.
Allegedly, it was because she felt U.S. policy was focusing pressure on Ukraine, the victim, instead of on Russia, the aggressor. That's the reported reason given to sources.
That gives a very specific reported insight into that internal debate. Wasn't there also a detail reported about U.S. resistance to a G7 statement?
Yes, exactly. The sources mentioned Washington reportedly putting the phrase further support for Ukraine into a G7 statement. This was being discussed by finance ministers.
Oh, okay.
So that detail, if reported accurately, again suggests this complex internal discussion happening within the U.S. approach as these sources capture it.
And connecting this back to Trump's reported involvement, The sources talk about his direct interactions, right? Including that significant phone call with Putin. What did the material suggest came from that?
Well, the reporting seems to suggest that after a call with Putin, Trump reportedly indicated Putin had agreed to start direct talks for a ceasefire. The sources note this claim apparently caused some, pause and concern among other leaders. He also reportedly asked Putin to draw up a kind of memorandum of peace to use as a basis for talks.
A memorandum of peace. Okay. And then the sources follow that with a video call Trump reportedly had with European leaders and President Zelensky.
That's right.
And the sources say Zelensky was urging Trump basically insist on an immediate ceasefire, make zero concessions without Ukraine's okay.
Yes, but then the New York Times has cited in the sources reporting that Trump told Zelensky he'd basically have to negotiate with Putin on his own.
Oh.
Which adds another layer. And then you have European leaders like Melania and Merz reportedly insisting any talks like that had to include the U.S. and Europe.
So a real divergence reported there on how any potential talks should even happen.
Seems like it, yeah, based on this reporting.
Okay, now just to add another angle on the military side of things, the sources brought up a Bloomberg analysis. It looked at the speed of Russian advances. What did that analysis reportedly find?
Well, the sources described this analysis comparing Russian progress over recent months. And the conclusion, reportedly, was that at the current pace, taking the entire Donetsk region would likely take several years.
Years?
Yeah, years. And occupying all of Ukraine, reportedly over a century. So this specific reported analysis offers a potential counter-narrative to any idea of a quick Russian military win.
Right, okay. So that's a dive into the U.S. dynamics reported in the sources. What about Russia? What picture did the sources paint of their stated aims, their internal narrative? There's that pretty striking report about Putin visiting the Kursk region.
Yeah, this report gives a fascinating, maybe blunt, reported insight. According to these sources, Putin was in a meeting with local officials, and he was reportedly presented with a proposal to capture the Sumy region of Ukraine.
Capture Sumy? And his reaction?
Sources say he cheerfully agreed and reportedly remarked, "Sumy must be ours."
Wow. Must be ours. That's presented as a very direct, explicit territorial goal reported right there in the material. Pretty notable.
It really is. And it seems to go beyond the more, let's say, official mantra that the sources also cite.
Right, the one about finishing what started in 22, dealing with the crisis causes, long-term peace conditions, Russian security, interests of Russian speakers, that sort of thing.
Exactly, that official line. But then the sources quote Kartapolov reflecting on that Sumy proposal, and he basically frames it as just needing more territory.
Simpler.
Yeah, the sources sort of interpret that as maybe suggesting a simpler motive underneath the official talk. And then the material cites Russian propagandists claiming Sumy is originally Russian territory, where sad Russians live in captivity.
Reinforcing that narrative of we always come for what's ours.
Precisely. That's the reported narrative push.
And beyond territory, the sources also present other really firm Russian positions, reported from top figures, Medvedev, for instance.
Yeah, Medvedev is quoted stating pretty starkly that Russia is aiming for Ukraine's unconditional capitulation.
Unconditional capitulation.
And he reportedly added that many in our country like that option much more.
And Lavrov.
Lavrov has reportedly stated quite openly that Russia will not allow a truce with Ukraine. So these reported statements from key players, they seem to set a very, very high bar, almost non-negotiable based on the conditions described in these sources.
Okay, now here's where it gets, really interesting, I thought. A completely different reported angle on the whole legal status of the conflict. The sources mention a report from Putin's advisor, Anton Kobyakov. What's the claim reported there?
It's quite something. The sources report Kobyakov claiming that, legally speaking, the USSR actually continues to exist.
The USSR still exists.
Well, his reported argument is that the way it was dissolved violated legal procedures. Specifically, the body that created the USSR, the Congress of People's Deputies, never formally dissolved it. That's the claim reported.
Huh.
And based on that, the sources report him calling the war in Ukraine not an international conflict at all, but a kind of domestic process.
A domestic process within a legally still existing USSR.
That's the reported argument. The material notes this idea has similarities to the the USSR citizen cult, which Russia's own justice ministry apparently called extremist back in 2022.
Wow. Okay, that is certainly a unique legal and historical frame for the conflict, as presented through that reported claim. It really underlines the battle for narrative, doesn't it? Which the sources also give an example of more in the information war space.
They do, yeah. A specific instance of alleged propaganda was about a supposed Russian breakthrough right to the border of the Dnipropetrovsk region. It was reported in Russian public channels, came with a photo.
Right, I remember reading that part in the sources, but it was reported as fake.
Exactly. The sources, citing Deep State, that's a Ukrainian open source intelligence project report.
It was faked.
And the material explained how. The details reported by Deep State.
Yeah, it laid it out. The pickup truck in the photo reportedly belonged to Ukrainian forces. Russian soldiers apparently found it stuck, took the photo with their flag, and then were subsequently killed right there. That's the sequence reported by Deep State.
Grim. And a key detail the sources included was that even a Russian military blogger, Yuri Podolyakov, he reportedly admitted.
He said admitting the photo was basically a PR action, not a real offensive push, and that the soldiers involved were killed on withdrawal.
But state TV, Solovyov specifically, initially hailed it as some huge achievement, reaching a state border.
That's what the sources report, yeah. He celebrated it initially.
And then, even after it was reportedly exposed, even admitted by some Russian sources like Podolyakov,
Solovyov is reported to still be trying to spin it, frame it as having impact, like a serious wake-up call for Zelensky's allies. So this specific example, as laid out in the sources, gives a reported window into how these info ops can work, allegedly even costing soldiers' lives for, well, a staged photo op.
It's a stark reported example, yeah.
Okay, moving beyond the sort of immediate Russia-Ukraine dynamic, the sources also brought in perspectives from other countries. Finland was mentioned?
Yeah, Finnish General Sami Nurmi. He's quoted predicting Russia will keep building up forces near its borders even after the war in Ukraine eventually ends.
What's he seeing now?
He notes they're seeing kind of moderate infrastructure prep work right now. Says there's no immediate threat to Finland or NATO from that direction, but
they're watching.
Exactly. Monitoring closely whether Russia sends more troops to Ukraine or puts more forces on the border. He reportedly believes they're actually doing both. So that gives a specific reported assessment from a neighbor.
It's interesting to put that reported assessment next to the reported view from former President Trump in these sources. He was asked about that Russian buildup near Finland, near Norway.
Right.
And the sources report Trump saying, "It doesn't worry me at all, they are completely safe." And then he reportedly added they'd be about as safe as Ukraine.
Yeah, given everything happening, that reported statement reads pretty ambiguously in the source material, doesn't it? Is the implication real safety or, shared danger?
Hard to say from the text alone. The sources also had a German perspective, Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. What did the material report him saying about Trump's approach?
Pistorius was reportedly quoted saying he thinks Trump basically misjudged the whole negotiation situation with Putin right from the beginning.
How so?
Well, according to the sources, Pistorius felt a key mistake was reportedly taking Ukraine's NATO membership off the table early on and also acknowledging Russian territorial claims. He felt that created a really bad negotiating position, reportedly.
So, despite all these differing views, these reported approaches we've talked about, the sources included a little detail suggesting some agreement has been reached between the U.S. and European partners, just on the format for future talks.
Yes, that's right. According to a European Commission spokeswoman, Paolo Peño, the sources report the sides have agreed on direct negotiations. Ukraine and Russia talking directly.
Okay.
But with the mandatory participation of European partners and the U.S., that's the reported agreement on format. The next step reported is organizing these talks, though the material didn't say where. It's a specific detail about reported diplomatic movement happening, maybe behind the scenes.
Okay. And finally, let's make sure we cover Ukraine's position as it's presented in these sources, particularly President Zelensky's reported stance on that crucial issue of territory.
Yeah, Zelensky is quoted really unequivocally in the sources on this. He says Ukraine will absolutely not withdraw troops from its own territory.
Calls it his constitutional duty.
Exactly. His duty, the military's duty, to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity. He reportedly says nobody will give up their land, their territories, their people, their homes. Very clear.
And he ties that reported stance directly to any ceasefire talks, right?
He does. The sources quote him saying, essentially, if Russia makes withdrawing Ukrainian troops from Ukrainian land a condition for talks,
Then what?
then they do not want a ceasefire and do not want the war to end because they clearly understand that Ukraine will not do this. So, yeah, Ukraine's reported position is laid out very clearly in the material.
And the sources also report Ukraine insists any peace memo has to be signed by everyone involved, must include an immediate ceasefire clause.
And the priorities mentioned in the material include prisoner exchanges, getting deported children back. There's reportedly work underway on a big exchange, maybe 1,000 for 1,000.
It really sounds like, based on these sources, Ukraine just doesn't trust Russia's reported intentions. Feels there's still a lack of clarity in Moscow's demands, like Moscow wants everything at once. It won't spell out specifics.
Yeah, that reported perception seems to stand a pretty stark contrast to Russia's own stated demand for unconditional capitulation that we talked about earlier.
So, okay, wrapping this up, what does all this mean? We've gone through quite a bit. The intense Senate questioning reported in the sources, those contrasting U.S. views on sanctions on negotiations. We delved into Russia's explicit reported statements about war aims, specific territories like Sumy. There's really remarkable claims about the USSR still existing legally.
Right.
And even looked at that specific reported case of alleged propaganda, the faked photo op.
Yeah, and if we try to connect that to the bigger picture, just based on what these sources provide, it really highlights a complex international scene. You've got deeply conflicting diplomatic approaches reported, ongoing military efforts that are assessed very differently in terms of pace and success, and these competing information campaigns just playing out constantly in public. We've seen that tension, right, between reported calls for unconditional surrender from one side and the absolute reported refusal to give up territory from the other. Plus all the talk about potential peace memorandums, but also the huge reported challenges in even getting to a ceasefire, given the demands being reported.
And the material definitely points to the scrutiny U.S. policy is under, both at home and from European allies, based on the reporting included.
It's a lot to take in. It really shows just how many reported layers there are to this situation. All the different reported statements, the actions described in these sources, they paint a picture of, seemingly firm reported red lines, very different assessments of what's actually happening, and this constant struggle for narrative control.
Absolutely.
Which maybe raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider as you think about what you've heard today, just from these particular sources. Given that the material describes leaders explicitly stating these maximalist, seemingly totally irreconcilable positions, and expressing such deep reported distrust, what path towards any kind of negotiated peace, if any, does this specific reported information actually suggest is realistically possible? Something to mull over.